Okay. Looks like we have most of the people here. I'm going to give this about 30 seconds for everyone to kind of get logged in here. And everyone that's logged in, you're at the correct spot. You're at identifying and caring for survivors of human trafficking. And it looks like about another minute or about another second or two. And I think we'll get started. So I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping here. The first thing to do is to make this experience a lot better, since it's run off the web, is what we've learned, is to make sure you close all programs. Those are trying to multitask, to close all the programs and applications on your computer. If there's anyone in your house right now, children that are gaming, sharing Wi-Fi, someone is streaming a movie, that's going to decrease your bandwidth, and it's potentially could get logged off and you have to reconnect. So just minimize. It's usually on the user end that can make the experience when the Wi-Fi is being stressed at the house. We all have different types of Ring doorbells and all that different things that share the Wi-Fi. So if you can just help out with on your end to do that, that'd be great. This is being recorded, and a replay will be sent to you within 24 hours. There'll also be a way to ask questions in that email. A survey will be sent via email immediately following, about an hour from now. An email will be sent. If you haven't included your license number, especially for the Florida docs, the number that you need so we can upload it to get credit for this, or any docs out there that haven't shared their OE tracker or license number, please make sure that we have that, and you can put that in the survey. Just tell us who you are, because we just have to have a name with it. The survey, we're not requiring any names, but if you do make a comment at the bottom, please just put who you are so we can attach the license number. And polling questions will be offered during this webinar, and that is to help with attendance and with being interactive. There's a question area, there's a chat box, and you can put your questions in that area, and we will distribute a handout throughout the presentation. I'll probably launch it as soon as Sarah starts to talk. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Saka, who can introduce our speaker for this presentation. Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Good morning. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. Sarah Beaumont. She's a pediatrician at Phoenix Children's Hospital. She's currently medical director of the Homeless Youth Outreach, which provides mobile-based services to homeless and at-risk youth in the Phoenix metropolitan area. She's also actively involved in residency education as a clinical assistant professor at the University of Arizona's College of Medicine. Dr. Bowman has been a member of the Governor's Task Force on Human Trafficking since 2018 and is currently serving as co-chair of the Victim Services Committee. We have the great pleasure of having her at our live event in Scottsdale this year, and we found that her message was very compelling. We've been loving working with her, and she is right now on Phoenix time, so it's very, very early for her, and we really appreciate her doing that. So with that, I'm going to turn this excellent presentation over to Dr. Sarah Beaumont.
Great. Thank you so much. A good morning and a welcome to all of you from Phoenix. And I want to thank you all for taking time out of your day to learn a little bit more about identifying and caring for survivors of human trafficking. I hope you're all staying safe and healthy. And with that, I'll begin. A lot of people ask me, how did I get involved in working with human trafficking survivors and victims? And they say, you just started a couple of years ago. And what I realized through education, I've been working with these victims for over 15 years. When I first started working with Homeless Youth Outreach, we would see youth on the streets who would engage in something that we called survival sex. The data shows that within 72 hours of being on the streets, over 60% of youth will be either asked or performing sex for food, money, or shelter. We called it survival sex, and that's what it was. We moved on to what their problems were. We weren't really getting at the issues. And as I've learned a lot more about human trafficking, I realized this is a problem that has been in our society for centuries. And really, our goal today, and my goal today, is to help you guys identify it sooner so that we can do a better job for our patients. Our main goals are to understand the scope of human trafficking, learn how to identify these victims, how to better address their medical and psychological needs, how to report, and how to identify resources to help victims of human trafficking. I do not have any financial disclosures. It's always important to start, I think, with the definition. And in 2000, the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act came out, and it defined human trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act in which the commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform such an act has not attained 18 years. By force, they're typically talking about physical kidnapping, rape, things like that. Fraud is when you're offering provide basic services for nothing in return, and then later something is asked of you. And coercion is typically blackmail, it's debt bondage, it's threatening family and friends of the individual. There are different forms of human trafficking. While I spend a majority of this talk talking about sex trafficking, I don't want to minimize labor trafficking. I think the reason we have more information about sex trafficking is because we know more. Typically, we see sex trafficking in a lot of different forms. It can be escort services or massage parlors, pornography, stripping, and erotic entertainment. Labor trafficking comes in a broad swath of activities: domestic work, agriculture, traveling sales crews, childcare, restaurants, lots of different options. This is a sort of heat map that's put out by a human trafficking nonprofit called Polaris, and this is a glimpse of what was going on in 2018. I think what's striking about this is that there's no place that is untouched by human trafficking. Clearly, areas in major cities are highlighted. In Arizona, we have we call it the triangle between Arizona, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles, and that's where typically these human trafficking victims are routed. Polaris received over 23,000 calls and was able to identify 11,000 victims of trafficking during 2018, which is when this picture was published. And interestingly enough, 25% of the calls were made by the victims themselves. So there's a little difference between human trafficking, not only in the method of trafficking, but related to demographics. Labor trafficking average age at time of exploitation is much older than sex trafficking, and its average is around 25. Because we don't know a lot because it is very infrequently reported and hard to identify. Recruitment is done through job offers online or advertisements. Come here and teach English. Come to this hotel chain and you can work your way up. Often false promises and the fraudulent claims are made. Smuggling can be involved with human trafficking and frequently coercion. And interestingly, a lot of familial forms of human trafficking. This is sort of your debt bondage. I'm going to send my child over there so that we are safe here and our child can send us money. So there's a lot of different forms of human trafficking. Sex trafficking, as you can see, engages in youth a lot younger. STIR stands for Sex Trafficking Intervention Research. It is a department out of Arizona State University. And they did landmark research between 2010 and 2016, where they looked at sex trafficking across the United States. And they also not only looked at the victims, but the traffickers. And at the time of this study, they found that 98% of the reported victims were female. I will tell you that we are learning with time that that number is less, meaning there are more males involved in human trafficking. The average age of first exploitation is 15. Now this is nationwide. It varies by state. In Arizona, it's 14. 2/3 of the victims are runaways. In working with homeless youth, we use the term runaway, but we also use the term throwaway. Many of these youth are kicked out of their homes because they refuse to agree to certain things in their home, or maybe their families disagree with certain lifestyle choices, or maybe they're trying to escape abuse. A great deal of these youth have been touched by foster care, and what we are finding is a lot of gender minority youth are at increased risk to be victims of trafficking. Who is targeted? There was a local pimp that was picked up and is now in jail. His sentence is 128 years. And when they asked him how did he target his youth, he said, "I make it my business to know what's going on in the lives of all the youth around me." He knew that targeting someone who was in an abusive home was an advantage. Made sure he knew it was his business to know what was going on in their home. So he had graduated from a high school, and in his later years in high school had become a pimp, and he stuck around that neighborhood. And he was really more of a sociopath in that sense, targeting those who were in tough situations at home, maybe disenfranchised with their families, having economic problems. But I think it's also important to recognize we tend to stereotype. It's only people lower socioeconomic status that get involved in trafficking, and that's not the case. We see people from diverse socioeconomic backgrounds, varied forms of education. They come from urban, rural, and suburban areas, as you saw on that heat map, but they also tend to have histories of substance use and abuse. One of the first trafficking victims that I encountered in a speaking forum was a 30-year-old woman who was raised in an upper socioeconomic environment, got to college, had a scholarship to compete in gymnastics. She had an injury. It was tough coming back from that injury, and she turned to drugs. And as she turned to drugs, she soon got enveloped into the world of trafficking and spent 7 years being trafficked. This is someone that came from what we would term a good household. So really anyone is prey to this. Where do they find the youth? I know that shopping malls are sort of disappearing, but they still find youth there. And in fact, my first actual patient that I met that was a trafficking victim was found in a local Arizona mall. She was 13 and she was walking the mall with her friends, and she was approached by someone who said, "You're really beautiful. You should be a model. Here, take my card. I would love to help you out with your career." She called them back, and at first they were pictures of her like we would imagine from the, I guess, 80s John Casablanca modeling. And then very soon they were asking her to take her clothes off, and she felt pressured to do that. And within 4 weeks of contact with this individual, she was being trafficked across state lines. She was a perfect candidate. Her parents were going through a divorce, and she was feeling that she was the reason for the divorce. So her self-esteem was very low, and she was looking for love and affection outside of the home. Bus stops are notorious, especially, the Greyhound bus stops. When kids are running away, that's usually the first form of transportation they will go to. As I mentioned with that pimp in Arizona, schools and after-school programs are very popular. Foster homes and group homes. I happened to be a medical care provider at a local group home, and we had a young female individual there who was acting as a pimp for the other youth, getting them on board for when they left the group home. Obviously, you can still get picked up on the streets, and then online has now become one of the most popular ways to solicit youth. They use all sorts of platforms. These are the ones that are fairly common: Instagram, Facebook, Snapchat, and Twitter. I don't want to, as we talked about males getting involved in trafficking, video gaming is another way that they lure youth. You friend someone that you think is your age, you talk with them, and the next thing you know, they're being trafficked. While this individual wasn't trafficked, I have an example of a youth in my clinic that was 12 and was playing video games and met someone online and agreed to meet this person at the park. And it was a 12-year-old male who was subsequently raped by an HIV positive predator. So video gaming is also another popular way to solicit youth. This picture here is an example of a rap artist in the Arizona area who posted his BBlue602 handle and encouraged girls to join him because they would make them famous with his music and they could be his girls. But on the down low, it was really a recruitment effort to get women involved in trafficking. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Backpage, but for those who are not, it's an advertising website that became the largest marketplace for the buying and selling of sex of both adults and children. It was in the press quite a bit because a number of victims who made it out alive tried to sue Backpage, and for years, the courts said that the victims did not have a voice. Backpage lawyers utilized their First Amendment rights and something called the Communications Decency Act, Section 230. This act was created in 1996, way before we knew what internet was going to become. And what the act stated was the owner of a web page was not to be held liable for things that happened on their web page. And that was how Backpage backed out and got out of a lot of judicial repercussions. Thankfully, April 11th, 2018, so almost 2 years ago, they had their website seized and they are no longer in action, and their owners are awaiting trial. So they made an amendment to Section 230 that said anything involving the trafficking of individuals was considered suable or not protected. As I mentioned, the STIR study looked at the trafficker. That small graph sort of talks about how people were approached or who they knew. A friendly stranger, sadly, was the highest percentage of those found to be trafficking, but worrisome are friends. We had a young girl who came from a middle class neighborhood. She was doing fine. She had some friends, but she was looking for something more. And a classmate of hers said, I can get you a gig that gets you a lot of money. And she was brought into the trade. And in the very beginning, she was very excited about it. She was making money. She was cool. She could buy things she didn't have. And that really prevented her from recognizing how she was being traumatized. And it was very hard for her to leave the trade after that. Romantic involvement, strangers, and then sadly, family. This data is from 2016. In a local survey done in Arizona, we have found that the percentage of family members that get their children or nieces or nephews involved in trafficking is much higher. We have one victim whose mother was a psychologist, and she sold her daughter so that she could feed her own drug habit. So people do a lot of things in order to survive, to feed their drug habit, and it is not just that stranger. The trafficker will also promise money and wealth, a place to stay. There's often a lot of gang affiliation, and the traffickers often have a history of violent crimes and drug use. I have this picture of Jeffrey Epstein up here because I think it's important to recognize that the trafficker can have all different looks, right? We have these stereotypes in our head, but a trafficker can be a police officer, it can be a teacher. When they did this survey, rap artist was the #1 profession, however, that lured women and youth into trafficking. So once they target the victim, they work on gaining their trust. As I mentioned before, with that youth at the mall, they filled a need that this girl was missing. They work on isolation, and then the abuse cycle begins. There's a lot of different terms and phrases for the traffickers out there. The gorilla pimp is one who rules by intimidation and controls with physical violence. The Romeo pimp is one who controls his victims through psychological manipulation. And so they can give them flowers and roses. You're beautiful. Here are all these clothes, but then they use physical force as a backup. I'm remiss if I use the word his, and I want to point out that there are women traffickers as well. because of the numbers of gang members that we see involved, there's the phrase of the gang pimp, and as I talked about, the family pimp. I think in the end, sex trafficking and labor trafficking are all about power and control, and it's much like the cycle of domestic violence. Coercion and threats and intimidation are involved, abuse and isolation. But then there's the denying, the blaming, and the minimizing, or what we call the gaslighting, is the phrase I think we see around today. There is sexual abuse and physical abuse, and they use privilege. So power and control are truly the roots behind those that are guilty of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. I think we're going to go ahead and try a poll question.
That is correct. I'm going to publish it now. The question should be up on the screen. And I see people weighing in, which is great. Traffickers, pimps are very stereotypical and can easily be identified on one site. So if everyone can please weigh in. We'll give it another few seconds here. Traffickers / pimps are very stereotypical and can easily be identified on site. True or false? Okay, I'm going to end the poll.
Perfect. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. And you can see here most of them replied false. So Sarah, please.
Right. The answer is false. And, I'll harken back to that picture of Jeffrey Epstein. I was giving a presentation and someone came up to me afterwards and said, you know what, I participated in the care of this individual, the medical care of this individual. And I never thought that something was wrong, even though he had very young women coming in with him all of the time. So while we have our stereotypes, and certainly the stereotypes can be true, it is important to recognize that not always, especially as we learn more about family involvement in the trafficking world. So now I want to bring it sort of to trafficking in the medical community. And this is probably one of the statistics that every time I see it, I think my heart stops a little bit. 88% of reported victims have come into contact with a medical professional while involved in trafficking. That is a tremendous number. And I can guarantee you that I am not, nor is anybody else, recognizing all of these victims when they come to see us and giving them the opportunity to step away or to help them if we can. I think there's a lot of barriers when it comes to being a healthcare worker in identifying these victims. First and foremost, it's lack of knowledge. And that's why we're trying to learn more. We're working with research institutions. We're working with the victims and survivors to learn more about how we can help. I think another problem is also inadequate training on trauma-informed care. And then cultural assumptions that we make about people when we see them that maybe prevent us from engaging and asking the tough questions. I think victims also have a tough time identifying as well. And there can be a lot of barriers to self-identification. Sometimes shame and guilt are a factor. Fear of retaliation. I had a 23-year-old female who came onto our mobile unit who was looking for birth control and evaluation for sexually transmitted infections. And it came out in the course of our conversation that she was being trafficked. And I asked her, listen, I've got a phone number here. I can call a liaison with the Phoenix Police Department. I can help you get out. And she said, I can't do that right now. I said, well, why? And she had a daughter that was staying with her sister, and her pimp put her in his car one day when she had started talking about leaving. And he followed them around for the day and basically said, I know where they are at all the time. I know how to get at them. And if you leave me, they're dead. So fear of retaliation is often a reason why they don't want to identify. And then I think importantly, lack of awareness of victims' rights in the United States is really important. And people in years past, we've always identified victims of human trafficking as prostitutes, and that they were doing this because they wanted to. And when the police would pick them up, it was, you're going to jail. And there wasn't help offered in the past. And I think the culture is changing with education, and that has made things a lot more seamless, so that if someone is getting picked up for trafficking, they're getting offered services first. And there are ways to, at least in the state of Arizona, expunge old records if they were related to a time period when they were being trafficked. So back to us in the medical community. This survey is the YES survey performed by ASU, and it queries approximately 200 to 250 homeless young adults every year in the Arizona area. This is 2017 data, and I just want to point out that asthma and poor vision are the top two reasons they came in to see a professional. 2018 data had poor vision as the number one reason. So this is why they come to see us. The often chronic pain, skin problems related to just being on the streets and walking all the time were also reasons. I'm always intrigued anecdotally by the sexually transmitted infection reason, because more often than not, this is, for me, one of the number one reasons that they come in. I'm not sure if they just didn't feel comfortable reporting that. But once again, things like asthma and poor vision are the number one reasons to see a provider. A lot of people ask, okay, so they're in my office. How am I supposed to know that this is someone I should be worried about? And there's a lot of red flags or things that can just raise the hair on the back of your neck. A discrepancy in the age of the individual. And this pertains more to those youth who look like they're 14, but are actually, or rather look like they are dressed to be 18, but they're actually 14. Another indicator is resistance to exam, or an individual that is with them that refuses to leave the room. And I have here older male, but I want to highlight that older females can be part of this problem as well. If there's any issues like homelessness or lack of identification or vague just visiting the area, those can be red flags. I think paying cash, and this was something I hadn't quite thought about, but was brought out in one of the other webinars. If someone is paying cash, that might be something that make you think, what's going on here, especially combined with some of the other items I mentioned. Then there's going to be, not only is it the people in the room, but if you do get a chance to examine them, the things you might see. We talk a lot about branding, and these are different forms of tattoos that indicate ownership by the trafficker. I talked about women being in the room and not wanting to leave the room with the victim, and we call that woman the bottom. So that is a female who may have been a victim of sex trafficking, who has then been sort of advanced and is now the recruiter and helps do all the work, supervising the girls, telling them where to go, collecting the money, inflicting the punishment as well. A victim may refer to the older male in the room as their daddy. And the other people in the room may also be their families. So these could be other girls that are involved in trafficking. There's a lot of different physical indicators of sex trafficking. I think some of the more obvious ones are evidence of sexual trauma, whether it's vaginal tears or bruising, or anal tears or bruising. We see a lot of cigarette burns, bruises, and fractures. The tattoos, I think, are really one of the most easy ways to engage an individual in conversation. You know, in the general population, most people get tattoos because of a meaningful life event. When you see things like these barcodes or owned by or property of, I tend to just use tattoos as a way to engage in conversation. Oh, I see this tattoo here. What does this mean to you? So these are things that I might worry about. Drug-related health issues, whether it's malnutrition, poor dentition, skin infections. And then we can't forget things like the headaches, back pain, and stomach pain. Some of these may be because they are dehydrated or not getting enough nutrition, but oftentimes we do see the physical manifestations of psychologic pain and distress. And so that's always important to remember. Bladder damage is something we also see, and that's because of recurrent sexually transmitted infections, TMJ problems, so a lot of temporomandibular joint problems because they're being forced to do 30 acts of sex in a night. Bite marks, we see a lot of hearing loss because they're getting beat and their eardrums are getting ruptured. Traumatic brain injury is a little bit harder to identify because oftentimes signs of PTSD can be altered mentation, irritability. We see a lot of bald patches, and those are typically underneath the top of the hair, and that's where they're pulling and yanking and trying to inflict injury but not making it visible. And then the obvious recurrent sexually transmitted infections that we see. From a labor trafficking standpoint, you could see any of these because obviously a lot of these are forms of physical abuse, but you might also see signs of chemical burns. I've heard people talk about getting chemicals tossed into their eyes, on their skin. They could be work-related trauma. So that's something also to look at. I think this is a good sort of synopsis by a survivor of human trafficking that really sort of explains a lot.
Okay, I'm going to start the video.
I was born and raised in a small town in Southern Oregon, and I was a good kid in school. I grew up in a normal middle-class family. I got great grades. I was really active in sports, and I even graduated a year early. I was accepted into Oregon State University, and I had my dorm room already assigned, and I was really excited to move up to Corvallis. But that summer I got pregnant by my boyfriend, and I had to make a real tough decision whether I was going to keep my baby and unenroll from university or get an abortion and keep it all a secret. And that was a really tough summer for me. After I had the baby, I had some friends that had gone up to U of O to go to college, and they had an extra room in one of their apartments. It was at that time that I met a boy or a guy who pretended to take interest in me. I really thought he liked me, and we got along really well. He was really funny and charming, and he had a nice car, and he always picked up the tab. He had nice clothes. He told me he was a record producer, that he had a band up in Portland, and that's why he frequently went out of town. There's a saying that says when you take a child by the hand, you take the mother by the heart. And I really think that's what happened for me, because I had this new little girl and this man who showed this desperate attention towards her, like he wanted to really help make this family that I really wanted for my daughter. And he invited me to move in with him after about 6 months of dating, and I was really excited. And I brought him down to Southern Oregon to meet my family, and everything seemed fine until we arrived in Las Vegas. He said we were moving there because that was the entertainment capital of the world, and being a record producer and having a band, that's where they were going to get the most gigs and the most jobs, and that's where his job was leading him. So I desperately wanted to go with him, to be with him, and to start this family that he promised me. He pulled up to an escort service, and he said, "This is how it works in Vegas. I've spent a lot of money to get you here. I put first and last on an apartment. I filled your fridge up with food, and you're gonna need to earn that money back." And I felt trapped. I felt like, how am I gonna get out of this? And you didn't know if you were gonna live or die. You didn't know what he was gonna do or what he was capable of, and so it was really scary. I can remember just running through the casino thinking, like, these people don't even have a clue what's going on. They're just, cha-ching, cha-ching, Las Vegas, yay! And they're doing all this stuff, and I'm running for my life. I'm running from a man that has forced me into doing things that I didn't want to do. When you have a trafficker that's waiting at home with your child and says, if you don't bring home $1,500, you're going to find your daughter out on the corner, I think I was probably more frightened to go home than I was to be in the room. Because if you got robbed, it was your fault for being stupid. If you got raped, it was your fault for not watching your back. Anything that happened to you was typically your fault, and you incurred more punishment for allowing those things to happen to you. So it made you always walk in fear of your trafficker.
I always think it's pretty moving whenever I see the story of Rebecca Binder. And if you have an opportunity, she has a nonprofit, and you can look her up just to learn a little bit more about her experience. We have another survey question.
And it has just been published. Which of the following is the most used by traffickers to obtain victims? And there are 4 choices there. Forcible drug use, social media and websites, forced kidnapping, convincing exotic entertainers to consensually participate in commercial sex acts. Which of the following is most used by traffickers to obtain victims? And we'll give it another few seconds here as I see answers rolling in. Sarah, looks like most of them are leaning towards social media and websites. A handful of weighed in on forcible drug use, forced kidnapping, and convincing exotic entertainers to consensually participate in commercial sex acts. So it looks like most are saying social media and websites.
And that is correct. That social media and websites are the most common way that traffickers are obtaining victims. I think in order to stay relevant, I have been talking to a few of the providers in the community, police officers, about what is happening during the COVID times. And because we cannot go out and are not as present on the streets, social media has now become almost the way in order to engage these victims. I do want to make a comment about forcible drug use. I think that is something that actually occurs later on in the relationship between a trafficker and their victim. Drugs are often utilized to calm the victims, pacify them, and then they work on getting them addicted so that they can utilize that as a hold over them. So we are seeing a lot in our emergency departments now of youth who are coming in very high and strung out. And that has been a way to keep these victims engaged with their trafficker, and it makes it harder for them to leave. So I think forcible drug use is definitely an issue, but it's more later on down the line, not necessarily in getting them involved into trafficking.
You know, Sarah, this is very important for everybody to hear your presentation, because we are so influenced by media and what we see. And I know a lot of people were taken by this hit movie with Liam Neeson called Taken. Mm-hmm. And it dealt with human trafficking, and it portrayed kidnapping, forcible kidnapping, as what seemed to be the only way this happens. And clearly, that's just not the case.
Right, correct. I think another good movie, if we're talking about ways to look at trafficking, I Am Jane Doe is a documentary that I believe is available on one of the streaming platforms that goes into the internet usage, Backpage, and the plight of the victims in the judicial system. So if you have an opportunity, I Am Jane Doe is a great documentary. So now I think, we've talked a little bit about how I recognize what are the signs, but we also need to talk a little bit about how are we interacting with these individuals. I think trauma-informed care is a term that has become very popular and very relevant, especially in this population. And really, it's the key that recognizing that traumatic experiences that these individuals have will influence how they interact with you and influence their behavior about themselves and their bodies. So if they're coming in to see you, they may be hyper vigilant about exams. As you are approaching them, getting close to their face, that may trigger them. They often have a mistrust of healthcare providers. I mentioned one of the barriers were some of our cultural assumptions that we make about people. And that is felt by victims when they're in the emergency departments. They can be anxious and be fearful of procedures because someone is doing something to their body that they did not consent to. I'm going to go back to the youth experience survey. This is 2018 data, and they sort of talked to the youth about what was going on in their lives and why were they on the streets. And I think this translates to why these youth are at increased risk. A majority had experienced emotional and verbal and physical abuse by their parents. They'd been bullied. Almost 40% had been involved in foster care. They had been involved in dating violence or had contact with law enforcement or the juvenile justice system. These are youth that have experienced so much trauma that they're looking to escape it. And unfortunately, they escape it in not a healthy way and get involved in the trafficking. Now, there are examples of youth who are forced. And as I mentioned, family can be involved. I had a young 15-year-old come in and we were talking and she wanted treatment for sexually transmitted infections. And I said to her, we started talking about, what her history was. And she looked at me and she said, "I'm just a slut." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And her story was that her mother at the age of, I think, 13 had told her, "You need to start giving money and contributing to this household or you are on the streets." And the girl was too young. She didn't want to be on the streets. So mom got her a job at a massage parlor and she worked the front desk for a while. And within 2 weeks, she was doing tricks in the back. So the amount of abuse that these youth experience in their homes shoves them into the streets, but that's not a safe place either. And they're at high risk there. So we as providers, I don't have a concrete way for people to interact. I think a lot of it's just based on being a kind human being. We are taught that we should be non-judgmental. We should be very deliberate with our word choices and really comfort these folks. No one deserves to be hurt. I think being respectful is also really important. There's a list of questions that you'll see on a lot of the human trafficking literature about what to ask. I like to just sort of start with, is there anything I can do to help you? But questions to try to get more information include, where are you from? How did you get here? This is where you might find that they've been moving around, like my one patient who was getting trafficked from Vegas to California to Arizona. Can you come and go as you please? Tell me about that tattoo. Who is this individual with you? For me, the biggest yield has always been, has anyone ever paid someone else to have sex with you? And I realize that that's a very bold and frank question, and you can certainly work yourself up to that. But it is a very revealing question, one that they tend to answer a lot more readily. I've had a number of survivors say, when you start asking about sexual history, if you ask me how many partners I have, I'm just going to shut down. I don't want to answer that question. So whether it's labor trafficking, has anyone ever paid someone else for you to be forced into labor work, or has anyone ever paid someone else to have sex with you, are reasonable questions to ask. I think it's important to recognize that, as I mentioned before, because of the trauma that these patients have endured, they may be angry, they may be hostile or irritable, or they may completely just withdrawn and numb. And I think it's important not to take that personally. As a practice, I try to always walk into each room, just sort of being accepting of where the individual that I'm working with is coming from. I don't succeed all the time, but I try, and it can help me be a lot more receptive to maybe a patient that may be angry and lashing out at me, things like that. There's no right way to approach a trafficked person. When we talk about the questions, there's no validated study out there that says these are the right questions and these are the best answers. But I think the most important thing that we can do is work on empowering these patients to participate in their care. They are involved in a lifestyle where the power has been taken away from them. And so if we give them control and we take away unpredictability, they are more likely to participate in their medical decision making, or to follow up. So I'm usually very purposeful about what I'm saying, and I always try to explain things very concretely and let them make the choice. It's also important, because we're all in the medical profession, to create a safe space. And that's just not in the back room where you're doing your exam. It starts at the front desk. It starts with everyone in your staff being trained on how to recognize trauma, and really work on communicating. But in the end, empowering patients is most important. I think striving for a mutually acceptable treatment plan is really important, and scheduling follow-up appointments. Oftentimes, and I'll talk about this in a second, if you're an adult, oftentimes they don't leave the trade and they don't want to. And we talked about reasons why that was the case. And it's not necessarily something that we can report in an adult. So developing that relationship, asking them to come back, are really good opportunities, so that they know that you are a safe person to talk to. As I just alluded to, if you identify someone under the age of 18, this is very easy. You call your police, local police, you call Child Protective Services, and there's nothing more that you need to do. You can contact the Human Trafficking Resource Center, as well as the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. The Human Trafficking Resource Center can also get you very specific information about individuals in the community that can be of help. But under the age of 18, it's very easy once you've identified. Over the age of 18 is much more of a challenge. I think the first time I experienced this frustration, and you guys may have experienced this as well, is when I had a victim of domestic violence come into my office. It wasn't a trafficking victim, but it was someone who had been beat up a week prior, but I was seeing them for injuries related to that afterwards. And she did not want to report. And I called the police. I said, listen, I have this individual here. I'm very concerned. I'd like to file a report. And they said, we can't accept that report. If she is in danger right now, you can call us. But if not, it is up to her. And so this is one of the most challenging things with victims of human trafficking. When they are brought into the trade at such a young age, initially there's an allure and excitement, and they don't want to leave. And then there's that almost Stockholm syndrome that happens. And most women will be in the trade anywhere from 8 to 9 years, or in the life rather. And that is when they finally feel comfortable or are ready to reach out. But that's 9 years, many of which are as an adult, where they aren't walking when given the opportunity. So really our job is to be a welcome face, help empower them, give them some autonomy, and then be there when they need us, and providing the resources while they're in your presence. I think it's very frustrating, because our job is to help, and sometimes we just can't help in the way that we want to. So the National Human Trafficking...
Sarah,
yeah,
Sarah, I just want to remind everyone to, if there's any questions, because I know you're getting close to the end here, if there's any questions, to just post them in the chat, and Joe and I can read them to you. So I just want to remind everyone to be able to post the questions in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no problem. So I keep referring back to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. I think this is a great resource. If you contact them, you can get their cards, you can get posters that can be placed in the bathrooms, so they can slip them into their shoes or their bras, but a resource that they can call if they need help. But know that it is also available for providers. So I really hope that you guys have learned something, and I appreciate you guys taking time out of your Saturday to listen. But I also want to know if anyone has any questions about anything that I've talked about.
Sarah, before we take the questions, one thing I thought was very compelling, and when this requirement for optometrists came out a short while ago, there is a lot of discussion on this board called ODs on Facebook, and it has about 40,000 optometrists on it. And people were questioning the need for this course, and somebody had posted, and it was a former student and friend of mine who had posted, now let's just be real. No trafficker is going to bring their victim in for glasses or contacts. And I think the most compelling thing for everybody on this call, on this webinar, is that vision is one of the prime reasons that they come in. And indeed, we can be seeing these people because a trafficker can bring somebody in for their health care. So I thought that was really a compelling thing that I learned from your talk.
Yeah, I think the traffickers, it is their business to try to have someone who is healthy, because if someone is not healthy, then they lose money. And so that is why they're often willing to do that. I have been on a mobile unit with the traffickers sitting right outside, and there's nothing I can do, but they routinely bring one of their girls to see us all the time. So it's pretty frightening. I saw someone ask a question: is there a good trick to getting the pimp out of the room? On our, I think there are good tricks. And one of the ones we like to utilize is just getting a urine sample. So I realized that in the optometry world, I'd have to brainstorm a little bit, but thinking of something in the office that needs to be done and doesn't require help of someone else, and removing the patient from the exam room briefly is often the best way to go. And often distraction, if you have someone helping you, having them engage the trafficker or the presumed trafficker while you're taking someone to put drops in your eyes, to do a different eye exam, you need a different type of machinery. Those would be ways that I would try to get them out of the room.
My thought, Sarah, would be, because these people are very controlling, one can always ask the suspected trafficker, hey, do you want to go check out some glasses you think she'll like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that gives that person that sense of control, and they may not actually understand the subterfuge.
Exactly.
Yeah, lots of great comments rolling in here, Sarah, about thank you very much, useful information, good course, eye-opener, every state should be required to take this. Lots of great comments. It looks like there's one here. It says, how to ensure one's own safety before reporting a case of a victim who has presented for an eye exam, ? Especially if the trafficker was present.
That's a great question. I think by law, we're all mandated reporters. And so sometimes there is fear in retribution if someone finds out that you have reported something. I think in a youth standpoint, they don't have to find out where the report came from. So I think you're protected in that sense. To be honest, I haven't seen cases of retribution on behalf of a trafficker when the report has been made, because they have other girls that they can work with. And maybe more often than not, it's the girl who gets removed, not the trafficker, that gets pinpointed and put in jail, if that makes sense.
A few people are making comments. I was thinking the same thing. You can request an auto refractor. Maybe the technician takes the patient down, and maybe the doc can sneak in and maybe ask the question, leaving. It says COVID-19 here. Only one person can be in the room. So that's kind of a nice comment there. Joe, you see anything else rolling in there?
Yeah, how to address a minor child with an adult in the room that doesn't fit. Seems like crossing a line to ask a minor these questions if my suspicion is wrong.
That's a good point. And I think a lot of that is understanding where kids are in their development and how to sneakily ask the questions. I'm not going to probably ask a 13-year-old, have you ever been forced to have sex for money? But it's about asking roundabout questions to try to get a picture of what's going on in the scenario. That's a really good question. I think we all make mistakes too. Cindy McCain is John McCain's wife, and she is the head of the McCain Institute, which is really engaged in getting education out there on human trafficking. And there was an article in the newspaper where she was at the airport and she saw a situation that she did not like and she was very comfortable with, and she called the police, and the police came over and investigated, and it did in fact turn out to be a parent and their child. And while a big deal was made of her doing that, the end result was that no one was angry. It was that there was concern. Yes, it was misdirected, but there was concern, and she reported it. So I think in the best case scenario, even if you report and the result is negative, and it's a young person, you're still doing what you can do as a mandated reporter in the best interest of the child.
We got one more question here. Then someone did raise their hand to speak. We'll save that to after this question, and then we'll get it wrapped up because we're getting right towards the criteria that is needed to make this course meet all the regulations. So we have a question here. It says, what criteria must be met for reporting to be mandated?
I think it's probably state specific, but in general, if you're concerned that there is any form of abuse or neglect, you have the responsibility to make the report. And you are protected by law in doing so.
And then I did about 2/3 of the way to everyone that's out there. I did share the slides or the handout through a file that was able to be downloaded, 6 slides per page. And I'm going to try. It's Anthony here is requested to speak. I'm not sure if that was just a bump or not, Sarah. So we'll just see what happens. I'm going to accept it. And Anthony, do you have a question out there for us or for Sarah? Okay.
Can I comment on something I just read?
Yeah,
I just want to. I appreciate what Julia Terry just said. Using your gut instinct, if something does not feel right or seem right, follow through. And I think really that is the most important thing. That I agree with that completely. I think that's the way that we should be practicing. I'll give an example of a case that wasn't related to human trafficking, but it was a young girl that I saw year after year after year. She had a lot of chronic health conditions, and she came in. At one point, her mother came to me and called and said she attempted suicide. She's in an adult hospital. She came into my office about a month later, and mom had a police report that was probably 80 pages long. And she said, I think I know what's been going on. Pretty obvious now. And it was a police report of her stepfather sexually abusing her and had been doing so for 2 years. And I remember looking back in my work with her, and I'd always ask the question. She never told me, but there was one visit in particular where I saw her interacting with her stepfather, and I thought that it was just off. There was something that was just not right there, but I didn't know what to do about it. And I feel horrible to this day knowing that eventually, like, I didn't recognize it. I didn't do anything about it. And then she attempted suicide, and thankfully she lived and she's doing well. But I think using the gut, which is something that we also learn about as we get older, can be one of the most important things to do.
There was a comment that said, this is such a difficult topic to listen to. And then it put, but, and I'm going to guess, but I'm glad I took it or glad I had to take it or something to that effect. But I agree. It was an eye opener for me, difficult to sit through, but glad I understand this a little bit deeper.
I am available if anyone has any questions. I think hopefully my email is on this slide, but if not, I'm happy to share that. But if you have any questions or thoughts, please reach out. I'm happy to be of service. It
will take us about a day or two to review who all attended here. We'll get it off to our conference coordinator, Vanessa. So being that it's Saturday morning, we'll work through the weekend here, and probably by Monday we'll start getting things uploaded to the regulatory sites. I would like to thank everyone for attending. I'd like thank Sarah for being here early in her time. It's like 7 or now maybe 8 o'clock her time. So thank you, Sarah. And I'm going to turn it over to Joe to make final comments.
Yeah, thank you for attending. We know that everybody has to have this course, especially in the state of Florida. But I think we're able to all agree that this is very important information that we should all have, and we appreciate the nice comments that we're getting from everybody, and it seems like you really enjoyed it. And I think, as usual, Sarah did a terrific job. And we do also want to say that a portion of your registration fee will be going towards a donation for the youth outreach program that Sarah is involved with. So with that, thank you. Please be safe. We're beginning to come back to normal, so to speak. And I think more things are opening up. But even though things are opening up, we still have to be cognizant that there is an invisible threat out there. So please be careful and enjoy your weekend. And good luck getting started again. So with that, I think we're going to be concluding our webinar. I want to give I guess you can say, an electronic round of applause to Sarah and the great job that she has done. I'm sure that just by saying it, I'm echoing everybody else's thoughts. So thank you again, Sarah.
Well, thank you. And you guys are doing just a great job by helping getting this word out there. So I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great weekend, guys.
All right, bye now. And remember, you'll be getting a letter of completion, and you will also get a copy of this presentation tomorrow. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you all for attending.